Carbon taxes may make governments feel good about their commitment to reducing the production of greenhouse gases. But are those taxes an effective way of changing behavior? There's no doubt they annoy taxpayers, and where does that tax money go? Well, in British Columbia, the money in part goes to low-income earners, northern and rural homeowners, and as a tax incentive to industries that reduce their emissions. According to the government's website, these initiatives help keep BC industries competitive. And finally, some of the money is dedicated to supporting investment in eligible emissions reduction projects. But are carbon taxes really working? Following the introduction of the carbon tax in BC, emissions did drop. However, as of 2014, which is the last reporting year on the provincial government's website, total emissions had pretty much returned to 2008 levels. An alternative approach to changing behavior is to simply change the rules. The government has the power to tweak, refine, and enhance rules without having to pass bills in the House. Rules manufacturers and industry have no choice but to follow. Regulations provide legislators with the ability to force the market into new ways of functioning that taxes do not. California is an example that demonstrates the effect regulations have on the altering of industry and consumer behavior. The push there to move toward electric vehicles has largely come about thanks to a shift in regulations rather than an increase in taxes. We invited Mark Jaccard, a professor of sustainable energy in the School of Resource and Environmental Management at SFU, to join us for a conversation that matters about the ways in which we can nudge, control, or force all of us to transition away from fossil fuels.
Conversations That Matter is a partner program for the Centre for Dialogue at Simon Fraser University. The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you.
We have some pretty aggressive climate targets, carbon reduction targets in Canada. But what's unclear to me is exactly how do we get from where we are now to where we want to be by 2030, 2050, and beyond? Is the answer through taxes or is it through regulation?
First, there's what goes on in terms of our buildings and our equipment and our cars and our technology. Mm-hmm. But the key question, which you've just asked, is how do you actually make that happen?
Yeah.
And that's a policy question. It's something that government at different levels will do, federal, provincial, municipal governments. And to what extent should they just do what's called a carbon tax, which is you just put a price on gasoline mm-hmm. that relates to the amount of carbon in the gasoline and the CO2 that would come out, because that's the main greenhouse gas that's causing climate change. You put a price on that, and if that price gets high enough, people will stop buying gasoline. They'll be buying cars that use biofuels, and we have those out there right now. Drive down the street, you'll see a flex fuel vehicle.
Right.
Well, pretty soon, people will be providing ethanol that flex fuel vehicles can burn. Mm-hmm. You see electric cars out there right now.
Yeah.
People will be buying more electric cars. So you can do it all with a carbon tax. And I, as an economist, am a strong supporter of a carbon tax. Mm-hmm. However, and there's the however, I notice when I experience trying to help people do carbon taxes in different jurisdictions, as I did in British Columbia almost 10 years ago, and what political scientists show me is that a carbon tax is a tough sell because people want to believe alternative evidence or alternative facts when it comes to carbon tax. And if someone says, "Oh, we're going to really hurt you with the carbon tax," and people say, "Oh yeah, I'm going to get hurt with that carbon tax," even though the government says, "Well, here's what we do with the revenue from the carbon tax. We're giving it back to you as an income tax cut." In British Columbia, we did that. Yeah. People were as well off, and most of them better off with the carbon tax, and everybody thought they were worse off. So the carbon tax was very difficult.
It's because of the psychological impact that the word tax has on you.
I think that's exactly it. And in fact, there are sort of leading political scientists and political economists who do research on that. And I, because of my experience in British Columbia with our carbon tax and the kind of fake news that came from all sort of sources about why this was a horrible thing, it made me realize, well, let me look at jurisdictions around the world that have actually moved quite quickly to reduce emissions. And when you look at that, what you'll find is a lot of regulations. Whether you're talking about Scandinavia, the Swedes regulating how different sectors in communities made electricity and what fuels they used, how they regulated their vehicles, how the Californians have regulated vehicles and fuels and electricity generation. I don't argue in favor of regulation because I think it's superior to carbon tax in any way, whether it's from equity or efficiency. But I argue let's not ignore it, because actually if you're really trying to hit those ambitious reductions that you mentioned, that's the jurisdictions in the world that are rapidly reducing emissions in certain sectors have been using regulations.
So with a tax, we're basically saying to the end user, you're going to pay for this. When we introduce regulations, do we shift the onus or the responsibility to the manufacturer?
That's a good point. The tax shows up in the cost of the final product of gasoline. The regulation tends to go after the fuel provider, the vehicle manufacturer, the electricity generator, the steel plant. And so, in a sense, that helps it to be more politically, or seem more politically palatable.
Got to get you to hang on for a second while we take a quick commercial break. We'll be right back. Sorry for the interruption, but I need your help. I'm asking you to support the show by becoming a patron. That means pledging $1 per show. Conversations is a unique program. There's no grandstanding, no arguing, no yelling. Instead, I sit down with people who have unique insights, specialized knowledge, and experiences that inform and enlighten. And we do this on an incredibly limited budget with a very small crew. Well, this is my office, and it's where I edit the show. And then once it's ready, we give it away. You know, so many different websites around the world are carrying the show, but they get it for free. They don't pay us. So I'm asking you to pledge $1 per show by going to patreon.com/conversations that matter. Thanks. We want to keep producing conversations, and with your help, we can. Now let's get back to the show. So it's my understanding there are about 100 million new automobiles that are manufactured globally every year, but only about 1% of them are electric or are alternative. And that's because most jurisdictions around the world don't have these kind of regulations in place. The easiest and cheapest way for them to go is to create a fuel-burning car.
You're going to hear people say, we've got innovations going on now to make the electric car attractive. And it's true. The electric car will be attractive in certain uses, you know, in a city like Vancouver, where I'm just getting from point A to point B and I'm never going to travel outside the city. But the gasoline car, the diesel truck, is a fantastic device. The energy density of the fuel, the weight of it, the portability of it, the ease of refueling, the power you get from it is fantastic. So
the ability to refill on your trip too.
To refill on your trip, absolutely. So all of these things mean that we have to force the market away from that. Now, there are interesting possibilities here. So both, if we look in California, you've had a dramatic increase in, some of this is pure electric cars, some of it's plug-in hybrid electrics, and they can run almost most of the time commuting on electricity, but you can still refuel them. They have an internal combustion engine as well for long distance travel. So there's innovations like that. There's also, soon with electric vehicles, a quick recharging capability that we can start to put on the highways, like on distances.
Well, I have to tell you that I was on a road trip down in California just recently, and there were all these Teslas lined up at a Tesla recharging station in the middle of the San Joaquin Valley. The challenge, of course, is, okay, what's the load on the electrical grid, and then how do we supply that? And so there is a shift that has to take place. But I think your point is that if we regulate that we need to move in that direction, then there is the impetus to do so.
And then you start to realize that all the things we said, oh, you can't drive an electric car from one city to the other. I mean, I used to say that 5 years ago. And so I was always plug-in hybrid electrics instead of just a pure plug-in car, battery electric car. And then now you're learning, oh, well, when California makes regulations that lead to more and more of those kind of cars sold, then pretty soon some innovator like Tesla, but it's not just Tesla, says, I'm going to develop some rapid recharge, which may not recharge your battery completely because it can get you enough to get you a long distance while you go in and get a coffee.
Yeah.
And so those are the things, kind of innovations. But to get back to your point about the 100 million cars or whatever it is they're sold every year, that is a huge challenge. But if we just take it on the car side and we think of where the car sales growth is happening, it's in the developing world.
Right.
And that's an interesting one, and I'll tell you why. The richest people in India, the elites in China, they live in Delhi, they live in Beijing, Shanghai.
Right.
That's where the air quality is horrendous.
Yes.
So it is them and their parents, grandparents, their children who are being negatively affected by this air quality. So as we're developing electric vehicles, you're finding that China, for example, wants to lead the world in the production of electric vehicles and is exploring regulations right now to phase out gasoline vehicles used in their big cities. So there is the impetus for this, the technology, so the impetus being, air quality, not necessarily greenhouse gas reduction, but it'll both happen. And there's the impetus for it, and then there's the drive from where the real growth in vehicles will happen, which is in China, India, and so on.
Well, China and India, though, have to stop producing electricity by burning coal for it to really have an impact. And so that's the other part of that equation.
Right.
And so then that has to become economically, viable or attractive to those governments.
And so what you'll see is coal use in China was going like this, right? And it's not now. It's like this.
Yeah, because they've stopped building new coal-fired electrical generation plants.
They've started closing down the older ones. So they're doing lots of renewables, wind and solar. They're expanding nuclear. They are putting in a little bit of natural gas, but it's mostly stopping that growth in coal.
Right.
And so and then finally you mentioned about, okay, what about the grid? How do we refuel electric vehicles, recharge them? That's not going to be very difficult, actually. The fortunate thing for electric vehicles is we already have a transmission system, a grid, and so in every home has electric current coming into it. So yes, you're going to have to reinforce, but the rates of reinforcement of producing electricity and transmitting it can grow with your electric vehicles. And the cost for that will have almost no effect on your electric rates.
Energy transition is underway. We're moving forward. It's going to take time, but we don't necessarily know where we're transitioning to. We need to still discover what some of those new innovations are. From your perspective, do we have what we need to be able to move where we need to go to, or does there need to be an ongoing investment in new innovations that will allow us to have a greener economy?
Actually, we could, in Canada alone, do what the federal government wants, which is a 80% reduction in greenhouse gases between now and 2050, with no technological innovation whatsoever.
None?
None.
It almost seems counterintuitive to hear that.
Well, that's because industry wants you to believe that we need innovation to reduce our emissions. So the first thing you should ask industry is, from 1984 to 1994, why did greenhouse gas emissions in Brazilian transport fall by 50%? So let's just stay on that for a while. Why did it fall by?
Yeah. So why did they?
Well, they just decided they didn't want to import oil anymore. They weren't producing their own oil. Now they have a lot of oil. And so they started to use sugarcane to make ethanol. And then the government regulated that those were the kind of vehicles that the industry had to sell. And it regulated that the price of ethanol would be had to be cheaper than the price of gasoline. And people all switched to ethanol. And so we who measure greenhouse gas emissions saw them plummet. So then here's another one. Then you'd have to ask, why did greenhouse gas emissions from the electricity sector in France from 1980 to 1990 fall by 90%?
It has to do with stopping burning coal.
Yeah, they built nuclear plants.
Yeah.
So
now there's a fear about that, and we won't do that in British Columbia.
Fine, but okay, why? So in Ontario, without building any new nuclear plants, why did greenhouse gas emissions from the electricity sector in 2004 to 2014 fall by 90%? 90%. Greenhouse gas emissions in electricity in Ontario fell by 90%. They phased out the coal plants. They replaced it. They ran their nuclear plants a bit better, but no real increase. They got a hydro power contract in from Quebec. They did more energy efficiency. They put in some natural gas, but hardly use any of it. It's to back up a whole bunch more wind and solar. They did some run-of-river hydro. They did some biomass, burning wood in one of the old coal plants. And their emissions fell by 80 or 90%. Where was the technological innovation that was necessary for this to happen? So now I've just given you transportation and electricity. I can give you other sectors around the world where it's so easy with the technologies we have. But nobody wants you to believe that.
And what you're describing about Ontario, you don't necessarily even have to regulate that. That just becomes policy changes in the sense that we, as the hydro or the Ontario Hydro, choose to do it this way.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
I'm calling that a regulation, but I think you're quite right to qualify what I'm saying, because if it's a publicly owned entity, then you are kind of regulating yourself in that sense. So in British Columbia, we put in a clean electricity requirement in January of 2007, just at a time
when the Clean
when
Energy Act, right?
No, this was 3 years before the Clean Energy Act.
Okay.
Yeah, and this is a time when BC Hydro had signed contracts for 2 coal plants to be built in British Columbia, right? And when that policy came in, which I worked hard for, and Gordon Campbell implemented it, I think they made the decision in the cabinet meeting in December of 2006, so it was announced in January 2007, and then BC Hydro had to tear up those contracts. And
thankfully, I'm glad that we're not burning coal in British Columbia.
Exactly, but at the time, people were, BC Hydro should be kept arm's length from the government. So what I'm saying is the government kind of regulated its own utility, but it was a regulation that would also affect other utilities if someone wanted to generate electricity, whether it was Fortis out in the Kootenays or whatever. So your point is well taken. In Sweden, for example, every community has a community utility that burns something to make hot water that goes through the pipes to heat the buildings and factories and so on, and it generates electricity. So we call that combined heat and power. We have some of that in Canada. And the Swedish government, the central government, said, you guys need to switch fuels. And so all those plants that burned coal switched over to forest wood waste. And the emissions went like this.
How are we doing nationally at the moment then in hitting our targets, and do you remain hopeful that we can get to where we need to be by 2030 and 2050?
Right, so people are critical, we can be critical of governments anywhere, and I can mention the provincial government and Alberta government and so on, but if we talk at the federal, national level, the criticism that people raise to our federal government is that it's inconsistent if it's approving oil pipelines that would allow expansion of the oil sands while also saying we're trying to reduce emissions. I'm not as critical as that, because I think it's, being a politician is about trade-off, and it's not easy. The federal government thus far has been making a very significant effort to reduce emissions. They have announced carbon pricing, politically unpopular with Saskatchewan and basically with all different areas in the country. So they've been willing to take a political hit for that. And so they're saying that by 2022, if they're reelected, that price will be up to $50. Today in British Columbia, it's $30. That's per ton of carbon dioxide emissions. So the federal government is taking a lead role here. And actually, as of this year, that provinces, Saskatchewan and so on, need to start out and get the first $10 per ton. So that's good. And then simply the point I was making to you earlier was that that's not enough.
Yeah.
You need, unless you're going to get that price going. So I did a study that showed that price has to $200 by 2030. And that would
have real impact.
Yeah, and that would add 40 cents a liter to the price of gasoline. So if the price of gasoline is $1.40, it would be $1.80.
Yeah.
Then you get a lot more electric cars, biofuel cars. But you'll get unelected. You won't survive. And so they're also doing regulations, and the regulations they're doing are going to have a huge effect.
Yeah.
So they're doing the phase out coal by 2030.
Yeah.
And basically the provinces are kind of buying into this. Alberta bought in. Saskatchewan's more reluctant, but even Nova Scotia and that, they're like, well, you got to help us out, but they're on a buy-in. That's huge, huge. So suddenly electricity across the country, not just in BC, Manitoba, Quebec, will be zero emission electricity.
Yeah.
Get your electric car. So they're doing that.
And that's where electric cars really make sense.
Well, but they do anyway because they're a way more efficient engine. So even if you
transfer power to the
even if you burn coal, in Indiana, if 50% of your electricity comes from coal, you still reduce emissions by buying an electric car.
Yeah.
Because its engine, its motor, is so much more efficient than the gasoline internal combustion engine. So it's a long calculation. But
I've always wondered about that, and I'm glad that you cleared it up.
Yeah.
So thank you.
I had to clear that up a lot because people will always say, "Well, we're burning coal to make electricity, then an electric vehicle is a bad thing."
Yeah.
And it's a benefit. The more your electricity is zero emission, then of course the better to get an electric car.
Yeah.
But even if you're having quite a bit of emissions when you generate electricity, the electric car can still be superior to an internal combustion engine. We have to do the calculation, that's all. But anyway, so my point was that what's the federal government doing now? So they have said, will we adopt what Alberta was starting with, a methane emission regulation, 45% reduction. That's huge.
Yeah.
The coal plant phase out by 2030, that's huge. And then they're saying we're going to do this, what's called a clean fuel standard. But I'm sorry to hit, everybody seems to have a new name for the same thing. Yeah. So I was just telling you about California's low carbon fuel standard, and British Columbia has a low carbon fuel standard that forces fuel providers to reduce the carbon in the mix of fuels they provide. So if I'm the gasoline provider, I've got to pay money to someone to subsidize someone to sell renewable, to sell ethanol or biodiesel or hydrogen or electricity. Yeah. And the federal government is designing a policy like that. And I and others are involved in that process just as people giving input.
I appreciate your insights. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. My pleasure.